The air crackled with energy discharges as plasma rounds seared through the battlefield. Veldros Prime, a once thriving diplomatic hub, had turned into a war zone under the relentless assault of the Zethari Dominion. The sky, thick with acrid smoke, flickered with the light of distant orbital bombardments. On the ground, soldiers scrambled between the rubble of a shattered city, exchanging fire with Zethari drones that skittered like mechanical arachnids across the crumbling infrastructure. Lieutenant Kevin Carter, a hardened soldier of the United Terran Forces, ducked behind a collapsed column, his pulse rifle warm in his grip. His squad had been assigned to protect the last surviving diplomats attempting to evacuate from the Veldros Consulate. Among them was Lyra Zalveth, a high-ranking emissary of the Lythene Federation. Lyra was unlike any being Kevin had encountered. Tall and statuesque, her sapphire-hued skin shimmered under the emergency beacons. Her luminous silver eyes, characteristic of her kind, reflected intelligence and restraint, even as chaos erupted around them. The Lythene were known for their diplomacy, but Kevin could see the tension in her poised stance. This was not her battlefield, and yet, survival demanded she navigate it. Lieutenant Carter. Lyra's voice rang through his comms. We need to move. The extraction vessel is 3 blocks east. Kevin gritted his teeth as another explosion rocked the street. Copy that, he muttered. Keep your head down and stay behind me. His squad, now reduced to 4 after the last engagement, formed a protective perimeter around the diplomats as they darted through the ruined cityscape. The Zethari forces were closing in, their insectoid drones flanking from above. Escape was becoming increasingly unlikely. And then, it happened. A high-pitched whine pierced the air. A Zethari plasma mortar, fired from above, was heading straight for them. Kevin didn't think. He moved. He lunged toward Lyra, shoving her aside as the mortar round detonated against the ground where she had stood just moments ago. The force of the explosion tore through his armor, hurling him across the battlefield. The world blurred into a haze of pain and noise. Darkness took him. A soft beeping sound echoed in Kevin's ears. He tried to move, but a dull, burning pain coursed through his body. When his vision cleared, he found himself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Smooth metal, dimly illuminated by soft blue lighting. He was no longer on Veldros Prime. Finally awake, soldier? The voice was melodic, yet tinged with relief. Lyra. Kevin turned his head. She was seated beside his recovery pod, her usually composed expression betraying concern. Her attire was different now, no longer the formal ambassadorial robes, but a more utilitarian outfit, one befitting someone who had just escaped a war zone. Where am I? His voice came out hoarse. Safe, she assured him. A Lythene medical ship picked us up after the extraction. Kevin let out a slow breath. He wasn't dead. That was a surprise. Given how hard the explosion had thrown him, he'd half expected to wake up in an afterlife, if there even was one. You saved my life, Lyra continued, her voice softer now. Kevin forced a smirk. Just doing my job. Her gaze didn't waver. Your job didn't require you to throw yourself into the line of fire. That was a choice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither duty nor diplomacy could quite define. Days passed. Kevin's wounds healed faster than expected, thanks to Lythene medical technology. The once sterile medical bay became a place of quiet conversation, an unlikely space where a hardened soldier and an alien diplomat learned about each other's worlds. Kevin told her about Earth, the vast oceans, the towering cities, the mistakes of humanity, and the things they fought to protect. Lyra, in turn, spoke of Lythene traditions, of a people who had long preferred words over weapons, and of the painful realization that diplomacy did not always prevent war. She laughed when he tried Lythene cuisine, wincing at its sharp, citrus-like bitterness. He teased her for being too proper when she hesitated to try Earth's version of coffee, eventually admitting she found it a perplexing but effective stimulant. It was a strange companionship, built in the quiet hours between duty and recovery. But war had no patience for such things. A transmission came through, urgent, direct. The United Terran forces were regrouping for a counteroffensive against the Zethari. Kevin's place was back on the battlefield. Lyra's, however, was somewhere else entirely. The time for farewells came too soon. Kevin stood before the docking bay of the Lythene ship, his gear reassembled, his body battle-ready once more. Lyra stood opposite him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to go," she said at last. Kevin exhaled. "You know I do." Her silver eyes locked onto his. "Then I hope your commanders know what you're worth. Because if they don't," she hesitated, as if debating whether to say what came next, "I do." It wasn't a declaration, not quite. But Kevin felt the weight of her words all the same. A moment stretched between them, filled with things neither had time to say. Then, without another word, he stepped onto the shuttle, leaving her behind. The war wasn't over yet, and neither was whatever had begun between them. The descent onto Veldros Prime was different this time. Kevin had left the planet broken, wounded, with the taste of plasma fire and blood thick in the air. Now, he returned with an entire Terran battalion, armed to the teeth, their dropships piercing the dense smog of war. The Zethari had entrenched themselves, reinforcing their positions in the ruins of the once great city. The counteroffensive had begun. Inside the troop bay of his Orion-class dropship, Kevin gripped the rifle in his hands, feeling its familiar weight. Around him, his fellow soldiers, some old comrades, some fresh recruits, checked their gear in silence. The plan was simple: crush the Zethari presence, retake the city, and secure the diplomatic district. But Kevin had his own objective. Somewhere beneath the carnage, Lyra's people were still trapped, a handful of Lythene diplomats who had never made it off-world. And Kevin had promised himself that if Lyra's mission of diplomacy still meant anything, he wouldn't let her kind die in a war they hadn't asked for. The dropship doors slid open, revealing hell itself. Kevin leaped down onto the cracked pavement as the second battle for Veldros Prime began. Meanwhile, light years away, Lyra stood before the High Council of the Lythene Federation in a chamber of polished obsidian and flowing holographic data streams. The council members, garbed in their traditional midnight blue robes, regarded her with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "You propose an alliance with the United Terran Forces?" One of the elder Lythene, Counselor Vale, leaned forward. "Humans are aggressive, reckless. Their wars burn everything in their path. Why should we entangle ourselves in their destruction?" Lyra kept her expression calm. "Because the Zethari will not stop at Veldros Prime. They will come for us next." A murmur spread through the council chamber. Lyra had seen it firsthand. The Zethari did not recognize neutrality. They consumed. They conquered. "Humanity fights because they must," Lyra continued, her voice steady. "We fight because we have no choice." Counselor Vale steepled his long, delicate fingers. "And this conviction of yours," he said slowly, "was it born on the battlefield? Or in the arms of the human who saved your life?" Lyra's silver eyes flashed, but she did not falter. "He risked everything to protect a diplomat from a species not his own. That is not the mark of a people who destroy without cause." Silence fell. The High Council deliberated, their voices a mix of logic and fear. But Lyra had planted the seed. The decision was no longer if the Lythene would fight, only when. Back on Veldros Prime, Kevin moved like a ghost through the ruins, his rifle spitting plasma bursts as he covered his squad's advance. The battle had turned into a brutal, street-to-street siege. Through the crackling comms, a voice rang out. "Lieutenant Carter, we've located the remaining Lythene diplomats. They're pinned down near the old consulate." Kevin's heart pounded. Lyra's people. "Send me the coordinates." "I'm moving in," he barked. Kevin broke away from the main force, sprinting across the rubble-strewn battlefield. The diplomatic sector was in ruins, the once pristine Lythene consulate now reduced to a twisted metal husk. Inside, the last survivors huddled behind shattered pillars, desperate, waiting for rescue. And the Zethari were coming for them. Kevin didn't hesitate. He stepped into the fire. His rifle screamed to life, plasma rounds cutting down the Zethari drones that skittered toward the diplomats. He dodged falling debris, weaving between the collapsing structure. A Lythene emissary locked eyes with him through the smoke. A woman with deep violet markings along her temples, Lyra's people's version of an elder. "You are the human from the stories," she whispered in disbelief. Kevin smirked, yanking her to cover. "Yeah, well, I hate disappointing people." Then, a deafening shriek tore through the air. A Zethari warform, 12 feet of chitinous death, dropped from above, its bladed arms gleaming. Kevin barely had time to move before it lunged. Lyra's personal communicator blinked on her desk. She wasn't supposed to take messages during council deliberations, but something inside her told her to look. A single transmission. Encoded. Kevin's ID signature. 3 words. Lythine Consulate. Trapped. The blood drained from her face. She stood so suddenly the entire council chamber turned to face her. Councillor Vale frowned. "What is the meaning of?" "The decision has been made for us," Lyra cut in. "Prepare the fleet." And for the first time in centuries, the Lythine warships moved. Kevin rolled beneath the warform's strike, barely avoiding its bladed arm. Sparks flew as its claws sheared through stone where he had been standing seconds before. He fired, but the beast's chitin deflected the plasma rounds like rain against steel. It was too fast, too strong, and he was running out of time. The diplomats had no chance against something like this. His mind worked at lightning speed. There was always a way. Then, his gaze landed on the shattered remains of a fusion core lying near the wreckage. A detonator. Kevin made a choice. He charged, sliding between the warform's legs, barely missing a swipe that would have torn him in half. His hands locked onto the detached fusion core, his fingers setting its last reserves to overload. He had 10 seconds. The warform shrieked, pivoting back toward him. Kevin gritted his teeth. "Come on, you ugly bastard." The detonator beeped. 8 seconds. The beast lunged. 6 seconds. Kevin threw himself forward, shoving the core into the creature's open mandibles. 3 seconds. A deafening explosion ripped through the chamber, engulfing them both in fire. When Lyra's fleet entered Veldros Prime's orbit, the city was still burning. She stood on the bridge of her warship, her hands gripping the railing as she took in the devastation below. And in the center of it all, where the consulate had once stood, was a battlefield graveyard. Smoke. Silence. No sign of Kevin. Lyra's heart clenched. No, he couldn't be gone. She turned sharply to her second-in-command. "Get me a ground team. Now." She was going down there herself. And if Kevin Carter was still alive, she would find him. Lyra stepped off the Lythine dropship as its repulsors kicked up a cloud of dust and smoke. Around her, a squad of Lythine shock troopers spread out, their sleek armor reflecting the firelight from the still-burning ruins. She barely noticed them. Her silver eyes scanned the devastation before her. The shattered remains of the consulate, the collapsed structures, the deep scars of battle. The stench of plasma burns and melted steel filled the air. Her heart pounded. Kevin had been here. His last transmission had come from this exact location. But now, nothing. A familiar voice crackled through her hollow comm. "Ambassador, we're detecting a massive thermal signature in the ruins ahead. It looks like an explosion epicenter." Lyra felt a chill. An explosion? Her mind raced. What had he done? She didn't wait for the soldiers. She ran. Stumbling over blackened rubble, she pushed forward, her breath tight in her chest. Then, just ahead, she saw it. A crater, still smoldering, its edges melted into slag. And in its center, half buried under wreckage, a body. Lyra's pulse stopped. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees, her hands trembling as she began pulling debris away. The armor was Terran. The insignia on the chest plate, United Terran Forces. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. It was him. But was he? Then she saw it. His chest moved. A weak, shuddering breath. Kevin Carter was alive. Get him onto the medical transport. Now. Lyra's voice cut through the battlefield haze, snapping the Lythine medics into action. They worked fast, scanning Kevin's broken body with precision. His armor was nearly fused to his skin from the heat. His left arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood, human blood, stained the ground beneath him. The chief medic, Vera, shook her head as she examined him. His vitals are unstable. internal bleeding, severe plasma burns. If we don't get him into cryostasis soon, Lyra snapped. Then do it. Don't stand there analyzing. Save him. The Lythene soldiers exchanged glances. It wasn't like their ambassador to raise her voice, to show anything less than perfect diplomatic composure. But this wasn't diplomacy. This was personal. Kevin's body was lifted onto the anti-grav stretcher, his head lolling slightly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, hazy with pain and sedation. Then, for the briefest moment, his gaze found hers. A ghost of a smirk. Didn't think you'd come for me, he rasped. Lyra clenched her fists, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. You idiot, she whispered. Of course I did. His eyelids drooped, his breathing slowed, and then darkness took him again. The hum of the medbay's life support systems was the only sound Lyra could focus on. She sat beside Kevin's recovery pod, her fingers curled around the edge of the seat, her mind caught between worry and frustration. She had seen Terran resilience before, but this was different. The injuries he had sustained should have killed him. No human should have survived what he had done. And yet, he had. Because of her. Because saving her people had mattered to him. Lyra exhaled slowly. There was something about him, something she hadn't fully understood before. Kevin Carter wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a human who had saved her life. He was someone willing to burn for others. A soft beep interrupted her thoughts. Lyra straightened. The stasis field flickered, and Kevin stirred. Pain. That was the first thing Kevin felt. A deep, bone-deep ache, like he had been torn apart and put back together the wrong way. Then, awareness. Cool air. The soft glow of artificial lighting. And a presence. He forced his eyes open. Lyra. She was seated beside him, her silver eyes watching him with an intensity he had never seen before. He tried to speak. His throat felt like sandpaper. Water, he croaked. Lyra moved immediately, fetching a small metallic vial. She held it to his lips, her movements careful, controlled. Too controlled. Kevin drank, his throat easing slightly. He tried to sit up, bad idea. Pain lanced through his ribs, and a groan escaped his lips. Lyra was there in an instant, pressing him back down gently. You're still healing. Don't be an idiot. Kevin smirked weakly. That's two idiots now. Starting to think you like calling me that. Lyra let out something that could have been a laugh, or a sigh of exasperation. Silence stretched between them. Not awkward, just unspoken things. Then Kevin exhaled. What happened down there? Did we get them out? Lyra nodded. The diplomats survived because of you. A pause. You should be dead. Kevin gave a half smirk. Guess I'm stubborn. She shook her head, something else flashing in her eyes, something almost like anger. You don't get to joke about this. Kevin blinked. She looked away, her jaw tight. You risked everything. Again. And for what? For your people, Kevin answered simply. Silence. Lyra's fingers curled slightly against the chair's armrest. You're a soldier. War is what you know. But you don't have to keep throwing yourself into the fire. Kevin studied her. Something about the way she said it, the way her voice almost cracked at the edges. You were worried about me, he murmured. She stiffened. Don't flatter yourself. But the way she avoided his gaze told him everything. A slow, knowing smirk crept onto his face. You totally were. Lyra sighed, pressing her fingers to her temples. You really are insufferable. Kevin chuckled, then winced, because laughing hurt like hell. But it was worth it, because for the first time, he saw it. Not just gratitude, not just duty, something more. Something that hadn't been there before Veldro's prime. Or maybe it had been there the whole time, and war had just stripped everything else away. Kevin's body still felt like a battlefield of its own, but his mind was sharper than it had been since waking. The soft glow of Lythene medical technology pulsed around him, keeping his battered body stable. He had felt pain before. Hell, he'd been through worse in past skirmishes, but something about this recovery was different. Because she was here. Lyra. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly, her posture composed as always. But Kevin wasn't stupid. He saw the tightness in her fingers, the barely perceptible tension in her shoulders. She wasn't just here out of diplomatic obligation. She had been waiting. For him. He let out a slow breath. "So," he said, voice hoarse but teasing, "any chance your fancy alien tech can get me back on my feet sooner? I've got a war to fight." Lyra's silver eyes narrowed. "You barely survived." "That's a no, then." You'd be an idiot to try." Kevin smirked, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs. "You keep calling me that. Starting to think you don't respect me, Ambassador." Something flickered in her gaze, something Kevin couldn't quite name. Then, unexpectedly, she leaned forward slightly. "You saved my people." Kevin's smirk faded. He studied her, noting the genuine weight behind those words. "Yeah," he said softly, "I did." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The war, the politics, the battle that had nearly killed him. It all faded into the background. There was only this. Only them. Then, Lyra exhaled and stood, her diplomatic mask slipping back into place. "You need to rest. Your body is still adjusting to our medical treatments." Kevin watched her for a beat longer. Then, with a lopsided grin, he muttered, "Yes, ma'am." 2 days passed. Kevin recovered faster than even the Lythene expected. His Terran physiology, mixed with their advanced regenerative treatments, made for an effective combination. But he was still grounded, at least for now, which meant he was stuck on Lythene Prime, the heart of the Federation. Not the worst place to be stranded, but Kevin wasn't exactly diplomatic material. The halls of the Lythene Grand Council were a stark contrast to the war zones he was used to. Dark, smooth architecture, flowing with ethereal energy currents. Holographic panels displayed political debates, fleet movements, trade agreements. And at the center of it all, Lyra. Kevin watched from the sidelines as she stood before the assembled council, her voice steady as she made her case. "The Zethari will not stop at Veldros Prime. They will push deeper, into our space, into our colonies. We have relied on neutrality for too long." Counselor Vale, ever the skeptic, steepled his long fingers. "And you propose war, Ambassador?" Lyra met his gaze evenly. "I propose an alliance. With the United Terran Forces." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Kevin exhaled. There it was. He knew this was her fight now, not just for her people's survival, but for a choice. To stand alongside humanity. To stand alongside him. But the council was slow, cautious, and Kevin had never been a patient man. So, against every protocol, against every diplomatic rule, he stepped forward. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Lyra turned, her expression unreadable, but Kevin swore he saw the faintest flicker of amusement in her silver eyes. "If you wait," Kevin said, voice cutting through the tension, "you'll be signing your own death warrant." Counselor Vale's gaze darkened. "Terran, this is not your place." Kevin shrugged. "Maybe not. But I'm alive because Lyra and her people saved my ass. And her people are alive because I did the same. You don't get to sit here in your fancy chairs and pretend war isn't coming." Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Counselor Vale smiled. "A soldier's bluntness," he mused. "How very human." Kevin crossed his arms. "You're damn right." More murmurs. The council was listening, and for the first time, Kevin saw it. The Lythene were changing. And Lyra? She was leading that change. Later that night, Lyra found him on one of the observation decks, staring out at the vast, endless stars. She approached quietly. "You do realize that was completely inappropriate." Kevin smirked. "What, calling out your politicians for dragging their feet?" She sighed. "You could have jeopardized everything, but I didn't." Silence. Kevin turned to look at her. Something had shifted between them. Before, they had been soldier and diplomat, protector and protected. Now they were something else. "You keep surprising me, Kevin Carter," she murmured. He grinned. "Good. Wouldn't want you getting bored." She exhaled, shaking her head. But there was no irritation in her expression, only something softer, something dangerously close to affection. He didn't push. Not yet. But he knew. This war had changed them, and they weren't done with each other. Not by a long shot. The decision came faster than expected. Only a day after Kevin's very unofficial intervention at the Lythene Grand Council, the ruling body sent out its first formal communication to the United Terran Forces. A proposed alliance. Conditional. Hesitant. But it was more than Kevin had expected from a species that had spent centuries avoiding war at all costs. Lyra had done it. She had convinced them. And Kevin had pushed them just far enough over the edge to make them realize they were already in this fight. The problem? War wasn't going to wait for alliances. The Zethari didn't take their defeat at Veldros Prime lightly. Less than a week after the battle, disturbing reports began filtering through Terran intelligence channels. Disappearances in outer colonies. Strange energy signatures detected near warplanes. Sightings of Zethari warforms lurking in the void between systems. And then, the first strike. A small Terran outpost on M-426, nothing more than a mining station, was wiped out overnight. No distress signals. No survivors. Just a silent, blackened crater where the base had once stood. Kevin read the after-action reports with a growing sense of unease. This isn't just a counterattack, he muttered. They're probing us. Lyra, standing beside him in the war room of the Lythene flagship, nodded grimly. Testing our weaknesses. Evaluating our response times. Kevin looked at her. They're planning something bigger. She didn't hesitate. Then we need to be faster. The United Terran Forces approved the alliance within hours of receiving the Lythene's offer. Humanity didn't hesitate when it came to war. Within days, the first joint operation between the Lythene and the UTF was underway. A covert strike mission, deep into Zethari-controlled space. Kevin wasn't surprised when he was assigned to lead it. He also wasn't surprised when Lyra insisted on coming with him. I'm not just a diplomat anymore, she said when he tried to argue. I've convinced my people to fight. Now I have to show them what that means. Kevin studied her. Gone was the composed ambassador in pristine robes. She now wore reinforced Lythene combat gear, sleek and flexible, built for agility rather than brute strength. A pulse carbine rested at her hip, a weapon she had likely trained with in secret. She was ready, or at least, she thought she was. Kevin sighed. All right, but stay close. She raised an eyebrow. I thought you said you weren't my bodyguard. He smirked. I lied. The mission was simple in theory. Infiltrate a captured Terran relay station in the Oris Belt, one of the outermost sectors under Zethari control. Retrieve whatever data they could on the enemy's next move. Get out. Simple. Except nothing was ever that simple. Kevin crouched behind a rusted bulkhead, scanning the flickering corridors of the ruined station. The power grid was failing, the lights pulsing weakly, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Beside him, Lyra moved like a ghost, her steps eerily silent. Her species had a natural grace that Kevin's people never could match. They advanced deeper into the station, their squad of 6 operatives moving in formation. 2 Terran Marines. 2 Lythene stealth operatives. Kevin and Lyra at the lead. Kevin's gut told him something was wrong. And his gut was never wrong. Then, a whispering sound. Something moving in the dark. Kevin barely had time to raise his weapon before hell broke loose. The first soldier died instantly. 1 second, he was standing guard. The next, his body was ripped backward into the shadows, a strangled gurgle escaping his lips before he was gone. The squad whirled, weapons raised, but there was nothing there. No enemy. No blood. Just silence. Kevin's grip on his rifle tightened. They're hunting us, Lyra whispered. Then, the second kill. A Lythene operative screamed as something fast and unnatural sliced through her armor, pulling her into the darkness. Kevin fired blindly into the shadows, but the bullets hit nothing. The Zethari had changed. No longer were they just mechanical drones and towering warforms. They had evolved. They had learned how to move unseen. Back-to-back formation. Kevin barked. They're picking us off. The squad closed ranks, weapons scanning in all directions. But the station's corridors were too dark, too quiet. Lyra's pulse carbine whined softly, charging a shot. Then, a whispering sound again. And Kevin realized, far too late, they weren't alone in here. It happened so fast. A blur of movement. A metallic claw flashing in the dim light. Lyra's body was yanked backward with inhuman force, disappearing into the shadows. Lyra! Kevin lunged after her, but she was already gone. Only the darkness remained, and the whispering voices of the Zethari laughing. Kevin had been in a lot of bad situations, but nothing, compared to this. Lyra was gone. His squad was down to 3 soldiers, and the Zethari were hunting them like prey. His mind screamed at him to stay focused, to survive, to regroup. But his heart? It had only one mission now. Get her back. Kevin reloaded his rifle, and then he stepped into the dark. Kevin moved without hesitation. The Zethari had taken Lyra. He didn't know if she was alive or already gone, but he knew one thing. He was going to get her back. The remaining members of his squad, Private Lorne and Sergeant Dale, watched him with wary eyes as he adjusted the settings on his pulse rifle. The station had gone deathly silent again, the flickering emergency lights casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. Sergeant Dale, the last surviving Lythene operative, shook her head. Carter, listen to me. She's gone. We don't know if... Kevin rounded on her. No, his voice was low, dangerous, unyielding. We don't leave our people behind. Dale exhaled, frustration flickering in her silver eyes. You're thinking like a human. Kevin's grip tightened on his rifle. Damn right I am. Lorne shifted uneasily. Sir, even if she's alive, we don't know where they took her. Kevin tapped his visor, pulling up the last recorded readings from his suit scanners. I do. A faint energy signature, barely detectable, buried beneath the interference of the station's failing systems. But it was there. A deep, pulsing resonance. A Zethari Hive node. And it was below them. Kevin turned, chambering a fresh plasma cartridge into his rifle. I'm going in. If you want to leave, do it now. Lorne looked between Kevin and Dale, hesitating. Then, with a sigh, he muttered, well, shit. If I die down here, I'm haunting you, sir. Dale exhaled sharply. I swear, humans are insane. But she readied her weapon anyway. Kevin nodded once. Then he led them into the abyss. The lower levels of the station were something else entirely. The walls no longer looked like metal. They pulsed. A dark, organic webbing had spread over the bulkheads, glistening under the weak emergency lighting. The Zethari hadn't just infested the station. They had remade it. Lorne swallowed hard. I don't like this. Kevin barely heard him. His focus was on the Hive's pulsing core, and the faint heat signature just beyond it. Lyra. She's close, he murmured. Then the shadows moved. Lyra was awake when they dragged her into the heart of the Hive. Her wrists were bound by organic restraints, an eerie biometal fusion that hummed with strange energy. The Zethari had taken her armor and weapons, leaving her in only her undersuit, the fabric torn in places from the struggle. She had tried to fight. She had failed. Now, she was at the mercy of the Zethari, if they even had such a thing. A Hive Lord loomed before her, its elongated head tilting as it studied her with those featureless black eyes. Then, without warning, it spoke, not in words, but in thought, a deep, reverberating whisper inside her skull. You are different from the others. Lyra clenched her jaw. Release me. The Zethari's mandibles clicked in something almost like amusement. No, you are valuable. She inhaled sharply as a wave of something foreign washed over her mind. An attempt to read her, to unravel her thoughts. She fought it, hard. And to her surprise, it recoiled. The Zethari couldn't break into her mind. Interesting. Lyra's lips curled into a smirk, despite the situation. You don't understand me, do you? The Hive Lord hissed. And then, the station shook. Distant, but unmistakable. Gunfire. Explosions. Lyra's pulse jumped. Kevin. He had come for her. Of course he had. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. Looks like you're out of time. Kevin didn't slow down. The Zethari came at them from all sides, their insectoid limbs flashing with razor-sharp precision. Plasma fire lit up the corridors, searing through the bioorganic structures of the Hive. Kevin's rifle screamed as he cut down another advancing drone. Lorne, Dale. Hold this position, he barked. I'm going in. Dale barely had time to curse before Kevin broke into a sprint, diving into the deeper recesses of the hive. Every step brought him closer. Then, ahead, an opening, a massive chamber, and in its center, Lyra, bound, but alive. Kevin didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The restraints shattered under Kevin's assault. Lyra didn't wait for him to reach her. The moment she was free, she moved, grabbing a fallen Zethary weapon from the floor and spinning toward the Hive Lord. The creature recoiled, its black eyes narrowing. It hadn't expected her to fight. Lyra smiled. Surprise. She opened fire. The Zethary screeched as energy blasts ripped through its carapace. The entire hive trembled as the Queen's pain echoed through the bio-network. Kevin reached Lyra just as the walls began collapsing. Time to go, he shouted. She didn't argue. They ran. The hive was coming down. Explosions rippled through the lower levels, fire and smoke choking the corridors as Kevin and Lyra raced for the exit. Behind them, the Hive Lord's dying screams echoed through the tunnels. Ahead, a drop, a massive chasm leading into the industrial sector of the station. Kevin skidded to a halt. No way across. Lyra glanced at him, then at the drop. Then, she grabbed his arm. What are you? She jumped, taking Kevin with her. The air rushed around them, gravity pulling them into the abyss. Kevin barely had time to curse before Lyra activated a hidden grav pack on her belt, slowing their descent just enough to crash land onto a lower platform. Kevin groaned, rolling onto his back. You're insane. Lyra smirked, standing over him. I learned from the best. Then, the station's evacuation sirens blared. They weren't safe yet, but Kevin grinned, because she was here. And that was all that mattered. The station was falling apart. Smoke and fire poured from the crumbling hive structure behind them. The Zethary drones, once precise hunters, were now erratic, their minds thrown into chaos by the death of their Hive Lord. But that didn't mean they weren't still deadly. Kevin gritted his teeth as he and Lyra sprinted through the collapsing corridors. The extraction ship was close. He could hear the distant hum of its engines, feel the heat from the external thrusters as it hovered near the docking bay. Almost there. Then, a piercing shriek. Kevin turned just in time to see one last Zethary warform emerge from the wreckage. It was different from the others. Larger. Stronger. A final guardian left behind to make sure the station took its enemies with it. And it was coming straight for them. Kevin shoved Lyra aside just as the warform lunged, its bladed limbs slicing through the air. He barely dodged, rolling across the debris-strewn floor, his rifle snapping up as he fired. The plasma rounds hit their mark, but didn't stop it. Lyra was already moving, her own weapon unleashing a volley of energy blasts. Still, the warform charged. Kevin knew, in that moment, that they wouldn't make it to the ship before it cut them down. There was only one option left. He locked eyes with Lyra. Go. Her expression darkened. No. Damn it, Lyra. I said no. Then, she acted. Lyra leapt forward, ducking beneath the warform's sweeping strike, sliding along the broken floor. In one swift motion, she twisted, slamming a small detonation charge onto the creature's exposed flank. It shrieked, clawing at the device. Too late. Kevin grabbed her wrist, yanking her back toward the exit just as the charge detonated. The explosion tore through the warform, sending a shockwave through the entire corridor. The force threw them forward, sending them both crashing onto the docking bay's loading ramp. The extraction pilot was already yelling, "Strap in. We're leaving now." Kevin groaned, pushing himself up. His ears rang, his body ached. But Lyra was there, alive, and that was all that mattered. The Lythene flagship jumped to warp the moment their extraction vessel docked. They had made it. The Zethary station, along with its hive, was gone. Destroyed. A critical blow to the enemy's expanding foothold in Terran space. Kevin sat in the medbay again, his wounds being tended to by Lythene medics. Lyra stood nearby, watching with her usual calm intensity. So, Kevin muttered, wincing as a medic ran a dermal regenerator over his arm. That was fun. Lyra arched an eyebrow. That's one word for it. Kevin chuckled, then hissed in pain. Damn injuries. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. Then Lyra spoke, softer this time. You were willing to stay behind. Kevin exhaled, shifting to look at her. Yeah. A pause. And you were willing to die for me, he pointed out. Lyra's expression didn't change. Yes. Kevin studied her for a long moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Then, Lyra took a step closer. The sterile hum of the medbay faded away. It was just them. You are reckless, she murmured. Frustrating. Stubborn. Kevin smirked. Starting to sound like you like me, Ambassador. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Perhaps. And then, she kissed him. It was soft, controlled, but there was fire beneath it. Kevin barely had time to register it before she pulled away, her silver eyes searching his. A challenge. A promise. Kevin grinned. Guess we're even now? Lyra smirked. Not even close. The war was far from over. The Zethari were wounded, but not defeated. The Lythene and Terrans had forged an alliance, but they still had battles to fight, enemies to face. But as Kevin sat there, watching Lyra walk away with that ever-present grace, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together.